A refrain I recall hearing a great deal not very long ago was that climate is not weather. Don't take a few chilly winters to mean the apocalypse has been averted. Any lumpen suggesting such a thing would be foolish. Despite climate science being touted as pure empiricism, you're forbidden from drawing any empirical conclusions according to your own lights. All of this goes out the window, of course, when there's a few steamy summers. Then the apocalypse is confirmed and weather most certainly is climate. And we get to hear about global boiling to really heat things up. This is at once a significant problem and wonderful boon for those who would like us to believe that nature itself is taking revenge on international capitalism, or that we, as a latter-day Prometheus, are due to have our livers repeatedly torn out, or that Gaia is shrugging off the virus that is humanity. There are plentiful classical antecedents to our present set of Armageddon merchants, because nothing is new under the sun, especially when they've essentially adapted chicken licken into a tract to leverage power. That it's always warm somewhere on Earth, perhaps somewhere unseasonably warm, provides fodder for their particular horsemen. That it's also cold somewhere, perhaps unseasonably cold, is a little less reassuring for the same set. We are a long way from those Ice Age predictions that Time magazine floated back in the 1970s. Part of the problem is that they want you to know it's all very empirical, because empiricism is the cause du jour of all science for the last couple of centuries. Empiricism, mind, generally needs regular, repeatable evidence before people will accept it prima facie. When the variables amount to the billions, as they must in the case of climate science, it's tempting to revert to simpler metrics, for which the climate apparatchiks can hardly be blamed, given their objectives are ultimately electoral. But when you base your evidence on a nice hot day, a nasty cold day might serve the opposite purpose. There's plenty of both, so the layman who is not privy to laboratories or computer models, and is perhaps growing a little distrustful of talking heads, eventually decides to trust his lights after all. Unless he's acting on faith, which is what all belief in the climate mantra amounts to. It's a postmodern addendum to Kierkegaard's leap of faith, but rather than transforming into the knight of faith, you'll transform into an insufferable climate activist instead. And it must take a significant amount of belief to keep faith with a set of principles that have moved the goalposts so consistently for many decades now. I remember growing up with an inconvenient truth, though even that particular piece of entertainment was late to the party. In 1989, it was announced that we would be underwater by 2000. In 2004, that Britain would be Siberia by 2020, or that they wouldn't know what snow is like by the same year. Or then Prince Charles saying we had 9 years back in 2009, or an ice-free Arctic by 2013, I could go on. Many of us are happy to extend lenience to fields that haven't quite found their feet yet, provided the stakes aren't too high. But this field simultaneously speaks with supreme confidence, insists the stakes are astronomical, and yet manages to always get things wrong, keeping a cause célèbre viable for decades, despite a proven track record of disappointment, is really quite impressive, and speaks to a powerful engine behind the scenes, one with grimy tentacles in all the major institutions, most of whom long ago accepted the thing as gospel. I don't like to comment on the science, I leave that to those with better pedigrees than I, but I can take note of the philosophical and intellectual predilections of those who push the thing eternally forwards. It has not helped that the alarmist researcher can gain all kinds of airtime, and that the obscure expert, otherwise unremarkable in the academy or elsewhere, suddenly has an unlimited line to power and financial grants. With such incentives in play, not to mention the pressure brought to bear by governments who love a crisis, fabricated or otherwise, and international organizations who, without such things, would have no purpose in existing, total fidelity might be too much to expect. The climate types are anti-civilizational, and see in climate change a useful battering ram to further increase the progressive ratchet that forever makes demands that are impossible to meet and intended as such. What climate change activists really hate is Western civilization, which has given the world everything and exists in spite of them, which they really can't abide. When you can't match your ancestors, desecrate their tombs instead. These are people who, despite their pretended concern for the future, are not truly invested in anything beyond the present. If you make comment about the way things are headed in terms that exclude the weather, you are likely to receive a shrug in return. and a statement about their not being around to see it. But, you might say, aren't you always on about the future, propounding images of 2080 like something painted by Hieronymus Bosch? I'm unsure they believe their own rhetoric anymore. They're nihilists at heart, and destruction in the name of preservation is the most cathartic sort. The desire for cheaply purchased amour propre springs eternal, and you can't help but suspect, as is the case for many a religious fanatic, things are more about them than about the planet. In a time of deep and abiding existential boredom, the sort that penetrates to the marrow of our thing, great calls to action can still move the heart. They might stir us from our carbon-producing firesides, to update Churchill's quip. Those hearts malnourished by what passes muster for our cultural life today need some sort of animating spirit beyond themselves. And how pleasant to find one that involves little more than recycling, riding a bike, and behaving excruciatingly at social gatherings. Virtue without difficulty or sacrifice is a temptation difficult to resist for the postmodern type, whether he's discussing Aborigines, the climate, or sexual deviancy. They claim to be appeasing the weather gods, but they're often appeasing a deep, abiding emptiness within at the same time.